I don't know if you guys saw what Trump recently said about the upcoming Zelensky-Putin meeting that he said for sure was happening after his meeting with Putin one-on-one. Take a listen.
People I don't like.
You think President Putin is so reluctant to meet with President Zelensky?
Because he doesn't like him. He doesn't like him. You know, they don't like. I have people I don't like. I don't like to meet with them. Sometimes I do like to meet with people I don't like.
So how do you get them together?
They don't like each other really. And if we had a real president instead of a guy that got in there with a fraudulent election, if we had a real president, that war would have never happened. Putin actually said, he said if Trump were president, it wouldn't have happened. Happened for a lot of reasons. Happened because of Afghanistan. When he saw how incompetent Milley was and all these guys were, I think he said, wow, this might be it. Because it was the apple of his eye. It would have.
So the question is, why is Putin so reluctant to meet with Zelensky? And then he quickly just says he doesn't like him and then moves on. Trump said he would get the war done in 24 hours. Trump then said 100 days, then 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, and then all these different deadlines. And now he's completely abandoned the idea of a ceasefire altogether for this pie-in-the-sky peace deal. Now, if you're so bodacious and chest-poundy over getting the war done so quick, and the thing that's holding it up is that Putin doesn't like him, like, I know there's a lot more holding it up, but just think of just how pathetic this excuse is considering what he said on the campaign trail. He said on the campaign trail that him getting elected itself, in and of itself, would end the war, that it would compel the Russians to come to the table and negotiate because they would realize the jig is up. And now, oh, well, you know I said next we were going to have the Putin-Zelensky meeting, and I know we also said that they already agreed to have a meeting, but Putin doesn't like him. 8 months in, and this is where we're at. Oh, sorry, we've run into an issue. What's that? Putin doesn't like Zelensky. Thanks. This negotiation process is going swimmingly. Mind you, at the same time that Trump holds back on sanctions, that Marco Rubio says on CBS, on 2 interviews, 2 journalists, that they're holding back on sanctions because they think if they implement sanctions, then it's going to close the door on negotiations. As they hold back on consequences that could make the Russians know that they're serious, know that the American administration's threats are to be believed, are to be taken with credibility, that when Trump says he's going to bring consequences, that he means it, that all these red lines are not just metaphorical or all not just for show, that they can really deliver on a threat and compel them to act. Instead of doing that, they're holding back, while at the same time thinking of sanctioning the European Union over their tech laws, over freedom of speech concerns. I shit you not. They're holding back on further sanctions as the Russians refuse to meet with Zelensky because they don't like him. But the Europeans will sanction them over free speech issues. At the same time, we're arresting journalists over op-eds. I mean, we're arresting students over op-eds. But this is where we're at. This is, how are you going to expect the Russians to take you seriously if they're like, I'm sorry, we don't like them, we don't want to meet with them, after you say you have to do it, after you say that you'd be disappointed if you went away from that last meeting without a ceasefire, and you went away from it not only without a ceasefire, but saying you no longer even wanted a ceasefire? How are they going to take you seriously? How are they going to think you're going to deliver on any threat whatsoever? If after all of that, you're turning to the Europeans thinking maybe you need to be sanctioned. Irrespective of what you think of the EU tech law, think about how that's read. Think about the image that takes. Why do you think the Russians would take any action not only to end the fighting, but to reel in the brutality of their war? Here is the human safari. Here is a man walking his dog that was targeted by Russia's human hunters, their drone pilots. I can't show you the footage, but this is posted by their units, by their drone units, posted on social media for people to watch, so people can donate to their units as they're hunting civilians on the street. These are the same units that have bombed ambulance drivers, medical crews, rescue workers. They have bombed fire trucks. They've bombed firefighters. They've scalped ambulance truck drivers as they're trying to drive injured people away from the strikes of civilian trucks, from civilian tragedies where civilians were hit by their bombing. I mean, this type of stuff happens regularly, and they post video of it, and they're going to continue to post video of it because they think that there's no consequences coming down the tube. And that's why they think they can act like that. And when you look at the diplomatic signals that are being sent by those outside of Donald Trump, those who are in his orbit, who are helping him make the ebbs and flows through this negotiation process, like J.D. Vance, who is the next in line if something happens to the oldest president in American history. Here is him talking about how this negotiation process goes, as he says that all wars end in negotiation, and then references World War II, a war that did not end with a negotiated ceasefire.
I want to get to security guarantees, but very quickly, if Russia is allowed to keep any of the territory that it illegally seized, what message does that send to China? Does it give China a green light to invade Taiwan? Does it give Russia a green light to invade other European countries, which is what your European allies are concerned about?
Well, first of all, the Ukrainians are going to ultimately make the determination about where you draw the territorial lines in their own country. But, Kristen, this is how wars ultimately get settled. If you go back to World War II, if you go back to World War I, if you go back to every major conflict in human history, they all end with some kind of negotiation. We're actually not active parties in the negotiation. We're effectively mediating. We're trying to mediate the Ukrainians and the Russians to come to some agreement. If the Ukrainians are willing to say something on territory that brings the conflict to the close, we're not going to stop them. We're also not going to force them because it's not our country. We're trying to play a constructive role. The president is trying to play a constructive role to bring peace to the region, but he's not going to force these parties to walk through the door. All he can do is open the door and ask them to negotiate in good faith.
Just want to quickly say that America would be much more helpful in bringing this war to a close, not as a mediator, but as somebody who could stand in Ukraine's corner and apply the leverage to make Russia understand that they're not going to drag this war out into a success. But putting that aside, he says that all wars end in negotiated settlements, and then references World War II, a war that ended after Mr. Adolf swallowed the barrel of his gun after giving his dog pain pills that killed them. Cyanide, actually. I don't think it was pain pills. He painted himself all over the ceiling of his bunker with his lover, and that was the end of that until Admiral Donitz eventually, after it went down the chain of command, surrendered unconditionally. That was the negotiation. The negotiation was, how would you like to take the pistol out of my holster, sir? That was the negotiation. The Japanese, they felt the full power of the sun before they unconditionally surrendered, and then they got to keep their emperor, which was essentially the biggest concession that they got. So when you talk about every war, the Italians, point is, this is a terrible example. That's not to say wars don't end typically with negotiation, but he couldn't have used a worse example than the Second World War. I don't know why he used that example out of all the examples in the world that he could have used. He does talk about, though, why he thinks this time around, even though, again, we're 8 months in and we're no closer, he thinks this time Putin is serious about peace.
Well, you talk about concessions, and yet the Russians rejected the ceasefire proposal that President Trump put forward. There's no meeting plan between President Putin and President Zelensky. And this week, Russia targeted an American factory in Ukraine. There were 600 people inside at the time. No one was killed. What makes you think President Putin is serious about peace?
Well, I didn't say they conceded on everything, but what they have conceded is the recognition that Ukraine will have territorial integrity after the war. They've recognized that they're not going to be able to install a puppet regime.
To be clear, the concession is Ukraine exists and we cannot choose who leads Ukraine. That's the concession, right? It's not they're going to give this thing back that they currently hold. It's these things that they never could achieve, they will not have. Not these things that they have now and they're conceding them back to you. It's these things that they could never achieve. Okay, then Ukraine just conceded that Putin's not going to be put on the firing line and executed for war crimes at the end of the war. That was their concession. Now you give them Mariupol in return for that. If we're going to do it in this game of, oh, the Russians said Ukraine's a country now. I remember, you want to know the one concession I saw the Russians acknowledged in public? They said that they acknowledge that Ukrainian is Ukraine's language. That was like some concession, some public concession I saw from a Russian government official in response to what they were willing to give up. They just nothing. They're willing to, they're giving up nothing, and they're saying just these things that we could not achieve. We acknowledge that right now we don't have this. That's our concession. Okay, well then the Ukrainians can respond just as ridiculously.
In Kiev. That was, of course, a major demand at the beginning. And importantly, they've acknowledged that there is going to be some security guarantee to the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Again, have they made every concession? Of course they haven't. Should they have started the war? Of course they haven't. But we're making progress, Kristen. And what I admire about the president in this moment is he's not asking 3.5 years ago. He's not, trying to focus on every nitpicky detail of how this thing started 3.5 years ago. He's trying to focus on the nitpicky details of now.
Those are the details of how you stop from starting again. If you don't look at how it started, then how are you going to stop it from starting again? If you just treat it like, oh, we just stumbled into it, and it wasn't like a war happened because troops invaded in this way, we need to make sure that doesn't happen again, that you got to have to look at those nitpicky details.
Of what do the parties disagree on? What do they agree on? And how do you build a foundation from one side of that ledger to the other so that you can stop the killing?
Is the only thing that President Trump is asking Russia to give up to not invade all of Ukraine. So after, she recognizes that saying their concession is, Ukraine still exists, she responds, is that really it?
Just to boil down what the Russian concessions might look like, is the only thing that President Trump is asking Russia to give up is not to invade all of Ukraine? No,
that's not it at all. It's providing the Ukrainians the kind of security guarantees that ensures that the country is not going to be invaded again. And this is really, this is why I think we've made a lot of progress, Kristen. Even though we're not yet there, why we've made a lot of progress is fundamentally the disagreement here is over security guarantees versus where you draw the battle lines in Ukraine. So whether we solve those issues, we've actually identified the two critical issues, one to the Ukrainians.
We're 8 months in and we've identified the problem. Could you imagine that you have a plumber stay at your house for 8 months? You're like, dude, you've been here for 8 months. Have you fixed my leaky pipe? Well, I can see it's leaking. We've identified the problem. Give me some more time. We'll get through this. Like, yeah, anyone could have told you that what land is and is not Ukraine and making sure Russia doesn't invade again are the big issues. Anyone could have told you that before you got inaugurated.
One to the Russians, and I think that is where the fruit, if we ultimately solve this thing, that's where the fruit of an agreement will come.
Talking not about progress, but about identifying the problem. That's how you know how little progress has been made. Also, I wanted to talk briefly about, because earlier you had the reporter asking JD Vance about China. You had her asking, like, look, if we deteriorate this respect of international norms when it comes to people's national sovereignty, could this lead to the Chinese feeling that they could launch a revanchist conquest of Taiwan? And JD Vance essentially hand-waved it. Hand-waved the idea, said it was basically ridiculous, silly. But basically, it was not really a concern of his, and he hasn't really expressed it as a concern of his. But I do want to throw out there that this type of thinking, that, China and Ukraine are connected, it does exist within the Trump administration. It's just that type of thinking is directed towards the idea that we need to divert our resources away from Ukraine over to China, and that's led by people like the Undersecretary State of Policy for Policy at the Pentagon, Elbridge Colby. And so these people have had this idea that we need to pivot over to China at the same time that Chinese industry is supporting the Russian war machine, at the same time that North Koreans are directly supporting the Russian war machine, at the same time that China seems very interested in how this war goes about, and they're looking at it to, pretty obviously test how the West reacts to this type of confrontation. All at that time, the message from people like Elbridge Colby is, hey, we pivot over away from Ukraine to Asia, to China. While the Taiwanese, for their part, they say, we want Ukraine to do as best as we can because they do see it as connected. So you can listen to the Taiwanese, you can see what the Chinese are doing, or you can listen to Elbridge Colby, whatever you want. But this has had real consequences. Here's 4 different examples of how Elbridge Colby and people at the Secretary of State, at the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth's office, have worked to undercut Ukraine. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth briefly and mistakenly halted a military aid shipment to Ukraine during President Trump's first weeks in office without getting final approval, a source familiar with the situation told the Post. Hegseth's verbal order, reported Tuesday by Reuters, stopped 11 U.S. military cargo planes from shipping artillery shells and munitions to the war-torn Eastern European country and followed a January 30th Oval Office meeting involving top national security officials, including Hegseth and the president. So this was the first time it occurred, trying to divert resources because they were fearful of what it would mean for China readiness. The Pentagon is pausing shipments of weapons to Ukraine again after more than 3 years of deliveries meant to bolster the country's defenses against invading Russian forces. The Trump administration's decision comes as Ukraine is facing intensified attack by Russia against its civilians. Then it's another one. This was from a month ago. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth paused a large package of weapon shipments to Ukraine. At the time, Hegseth was acting in accordance with the Pentagon memo written by Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, a noted skeptic of arming Ukraine. And this is within the last 48 hours. A high-level Defense Department approval procedure, which hasn't been announced, has prevented Ukraine from firing any U.S.-made long-range Army tactical missile systems or ATACMS against targets in Russia since last spring. On at least one occasion, Ukraine sought to use ATACMS against a target on Russian territory, but was rejected. The U.S. veto of long-range strikes has restricted Ukraine's military operations as the White House has sought to woo the Kremlin into beginning peace talks. The fact, 8 months in, beginning peace talks. Elbridge Colby, the Pentagon's Undersecretary for Policy, developed the review mechanism to decide on Kiev's request to fire long-range U.S.-made weapons, as well as those provided to Ukraine by European allies that rely on American intelligence components. Meaning this is not just for ATACMS that they're restricting these strikes. These are also for Storm Shadows. These are also for French and British and European provided long-range munitions. As long as they are using American intelligence, they can restrict and they can deny targets that they have the full right under international law to strike under responding to the crime of aggression. So a lot of this was done under the auspice, definitely when it comes to the halting of shipments over, we need to pivot towards Asia, we need to pivot towards China. This is definitely what Pete Hegseth and Elbridge Colby was pitching. The problem is, number one, a lot of those munitions that were being halted were stuff that we don't need for a war with China. We're talking about like MLRS rockets that are for systems that in a confrontation over Taiwan, you're not going to expect to be in extremely heavy demand. They're not the stuff that we have really big shortage of over there. Some of it just did not make much sense. The other problem was that at the same time that they were making this call that we needed to block these shipments, the Trump administration was going on with a Houthi bombing campaign that was using the very munitions that we would use with a confrontation with China, with a war with China, on the Houthis, using them in abundance at a rate that was over the rate of replenishment, meaning we were using more bombs than we could make. And they were the exact type of long-range munitions, including anti-ship bombs, that would be useful for a war with China, and we use it against the Houthis, a target we've been bombing for the better part of a decade with very little success. That we've done through the Obama administration, the Trump administration 1.0, Biden administration, and now Trump administration 2.0. And so we can be wasting these bombs over here, dropping them on the Houthis, but munitions that don't even necessarily need to be used for a war with China, those are going to be blocked for potential confrontation with China. It just did not add up. Not only do I think this is counterproductive towards the goal of trying to, discourage Chinese revanchism, it just didn't really make much sense. Oh, also, Albert Colby, he only trusts the best in news. By the way, there was this thing that he mentioned, and I wanted to turn over to this Sergei Lavrov interview for a moment. I also saw somebody in chat asking that I look at this, and look, we are looking at it. We are looking at it. In that interview, JD Vance is confronted saying, hey, the Russians bombed an American company on a border between Ukraine and Hungary where 600 people were working. What's the response? What's your reaction? Where's your outrage? What's his reaction? And he basically just reacts to it in a limp-wristed manner. It's like, well, it's war, and I'm not happy about it. I'm not happy about it, was the biggest condemnation that they could get out of Mr. J.D. Vance. Mind you, that J.D. Vance got angry at Zelensky during their meeting in the Oval Office for the idea, for Zelensky floating the possibility, the 1 in a million chance that, hey guys, maybe it isn't going to be enough to have American investments in Ukraine to stop Russian bombing. Maybe the Russians would just bomb the investments anyway. Oh my gosh, why are you being such a problem for peace? We got to freeze aid. We got to do this. Now the Russians bomb an American company with over 600 people working there. JD Vance's reaction, I don't like it. How is the Ukrainians? How did anybody with a brain cell or with any functionality up in the noggin, how is anybody going to look at that and say, yes, that looks like a security guarantee that'll hold? If the Russians are bombing the American companies right now, how do we expect that to stop another war? Anyway, here's Sergei Lavrov responding. If they're going to look at the vice president of the United States and he's going to basically shrug at a U.S. company being bombed, here's how Sergei Lavrov responds when confronted with the same idea, knowing JD Vance's response.
Just this week, Russia bombed an American-owned factory near the Hungarian border. I've spoken to people who frankly see that as a slap in the face to President Trump, to the entire peace process, isn't it?
Well, I would say that those who are sincerely interested in understanding what is going on should know by now that never ever Russia deliberately targeted any sites which are not linked to military abilities of Ukraine.
This is an electronics factory, though, sir. This is an electronics factory. I've spoken to people on the ground there. It builds coffee machines, among other electronics. This is not a military site.
Well, I understand that some people are really naive, and when they see a coffee machine in the window, they believe that this is the place where coffee machines are produced. Our intelligence has very good information. And we target only, as I said, either military enterprises, military sites, or industrial enterprises.
I've seen nursing homes that have been bombed in the Sumy region by the Russians. There have been many malls that have been bombed. There's been marketplaces that have been bombed. There have been children's cancer wards that have been hit by ballistic Russian missiles. There have been plenty of instances of this. So, I mean, is there any evidence that it's a military target of some note that they could show? Did they have some, here's some documents showing clearly that? Did they even bother to attempt?
Enterprises directly involved in producing military equipment for Ukrainian army. And on the contrary, I never recall any concern expressed by the media in the West regarding the activities of Ukrainian armed forces when they, for example, in the Kursk region, when they invaded it one year ago, there is no military targets at all. All the targets which they have been hitting daily are civilian. They, by the way, took civilian hostages from there who had nothing to do with the conflict. Recently, they undertook the third attempt to blow up the Crimean bridge. They attacked a few days ago another nuclear power station. They used to attack the one in Zaporizhia.
So I filmed people fighting the Kursk region. I mean, the Ukrainians would blow up things like gas stations. I filmed them doing stuff like that. So there was like infrastructure that would also be used by civilians, but a lot of that stuff has then been turned into military positions and such. So like making a determination about any one piece of footage could be difficult. But I mean, like the Russians have been bombing over the border in the Kursk region, using the Kursk region to attack Ukraine for the entirety of the war. As for the Kerch Bridge, they've been using it to supply and transport military supplies, again, for the entirety of the war.
Now they attacked the nuclear power station in Smolensk, and they continue to do this. They continue to exercise terrorist attacks. There is no other way to call them. So
Mr. Foreign Minister?
But if you believe that if there is American capital in an enterprise which is used to produce weapons to kill Russians, and you believe that, be it American, be it Hungarian, be it anybody's capital, that this gives impunity to those who build weapons to kill us? I don't think so. I don't think this is fair. This is kind of, I would say, imperialistic.
Mr. Foreign Minister, just
imperialistic. When we blow up your businesses, it's very imperialistic for you to say that we can't do that. Have you checked your bombed privilege?
To confirm, you are confirming that Russia did in fact target and attack the American-owned company that was hit this week.
You should be professor in the Soviet universities, because you twisted very interestingly what I said. I did not say that I confirmed that incident. I never heard of it. I just asked a rhetorical.
I love it. I love it. Oh my God, I love the Russian foreign ministry. Oh my God. The first 3 minutes, coffee makers, you say that factory made coffee makers. Well, you're naive. How we have good information. We only strike real military targets. We only strike things that are attacking the Russian Federation. And if that company had American investments and American workers or 600 people working there, the reason we struck it, and whether or not there was American investments or America was involved in any way, was because it was attacking Russia. And if there's any factory that's attacking Russia, then we have to strike and defend ourselves. So you're saying that you confirming that you guys struck it. Struck it? Struck what? I never heard of it. I never heard of it. What? There's a factory? Coffee what? Dude, I love the Russian foreign ministry, man. Oh my gosh. Speed run.
Rhetorical question. Do you believe that if there is an enterprise producing weapons and being part of the Ukrainian military machine, intended to produce things to kill Russian citizens, and just because this enterprise happened to have some American capital in it, it should be immune? That was my question. I have not heard about the episode, and if you can send me some reference to this incident to which you referred, I would look at it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News.
Stay updated on breaking news. One more Lavrov segment I wanted to show, because this is in reference to Marco Rubio. This is in reference to Donald Trump. This is in reference to what they said after their meeting with Putin,
immoral,
is that it was a
morally
success.
Corrupt, bankrupt man.
Trump said in advance, "Hey, cruise missile. Thanks for the primer. Cruise missile. Thanks for the primer, man." they said that if they walked away from this meeting without a ceasefire, that it would be a failure. Then they walked away and said it was 10 out of 10 because, well, at least they had next steps and they knew where to go from here. And you know, JD Vance is saying, well, at least we identified what the problem is in this war. But the idea was at least next we could have a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. And then the Russians started making some noise about, well, how about in Moscow, right? Ha 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 ha. Well, you know, we actually need to make sure that this guy talks to this guy first and this guy talks to this guy. And now we've got the answer right out of the horse's mouth from Sergei Lavrov saying that no Putin-Zelensky meeting is planned after Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, Donald Trump, all of them said this was next, that they got this, that the meeting was not a failure, because even though they didn't get a ceasefire, and now they even abandoned the pursuance of a ceasefire, and they had to get the Europeans to come over and be like, hey, no, please, we still want one. After all that, they had this meeting at least. Never mind. It doesn't look like it.
So bottom line, there's no meeting planned.
President Putin said clearly that he is ready to meet, provided this meeting is really going to have an agenda, presidential agenda.
So that's a big if. There's no meeting planned, Mr. Foreign Minister. That's a big if. You're saying there's no meeting planned right now.
Kristen, I'm awfully sorry, you're not listening. There is no meeting planned, and I'm not challenging this. But you cannot, I think, understand what I am saying. Putin is ready to meet with Zelensky when the agenda would be ready for a summit. And this agenda is not ready at all. President Trump suggested after Anchorage several.
Basically, they keep saying they need an agenda that addresses the core issues, and the core issues being things like Ukraine's demilitarization, Ukraine giving up Kherson and Zaporizhia, Ukraine not joining any military structure that could stop a future invasion. Like there's these core issues, since they've not been attended to, and since they are not included on the summit, then why would they even talk? Especially since Zelensky is an illegitimate president anyway because of his constitutional term. So they've got like a barrel full of monkey of excuses, a barrel full of monkey of excuses to get out of this meeting and run away from what Trump said was the next step.
Points which we share, and on some of them we agreed to show some flexibility.
Okay.
When President Trump brought those issues to the meeting in Washington, with Zelensky present together with his European sponsors, he clearly indicated, it was very clear to everybody that there are several principles which Washington believes must be accepted, including no NATO membership, including the discussion of territorial issues. And Zelensky said no to everything. He even said no to, as I said, to canceling legislation prohibiting the Russian language. How can we meet with a person who is pretending to be a leader?
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news.
Okay. That's enough of Sergei Lavrov. I don't want to listen to this fool any longer. Don't like him, that dude. One last thing. I had to throw this piece of news at you because I thought this was fascinating. So, after that spat in the Oval Office between Zelensky and Trump, with JD Vance lecturing the Ukrainian president like he was a child, there was a period where the Trump administration seemed to genuinely be sniffing around to see if they could replace Zelensky, as in replace the president of Ukraine with somebody else, so that they would have somebody that they thought would be more agreeable to America or their, under your interpretation, interests. Basically, they were looking to get rid of Zelensky, replace him. And one of the things that they did is they got JD Vance to go call Zelensky. Now, if you guys don't know who Zelensky is the former commander of the Ukrainian armed forces. He was the person who was leading the Ukrainian army during the first year of the war and was essentially the top dog who was helping to stop the country from collapsing through the leadership position. How much of that defense was up to his leadership, up to the everyday Ukrainians who, of course, picked up rifle and defended street by street? I'll leave that up to the historians. But the wide consensus in Ukraine is that he's popular. He's popular. He's seen as a war hero, and he's currently serving as ambassador to the United Kingdom after being replaced by Alexander Sursky, who is somebody who has not gained the same amount of respect as Zelensky from general society. Zelensky polls better than Zelensky in just about every poll. He is the one person who I could say I would not be surprised would beat Zelensky in an election. That's not to say that he would beat Zelensky in an election. That's not to even say that he would 100% run for an election, even though I think he's certainly floating the idea around in his noggin. I am just saying that he is the one that is certainly the most realistic because he clearly polls better than him. And he's liked by most Ukrainians. The problem is, though, when J.D. Vance called him, Zelensky refused to return his call. And in the days after, as the vice president was trying to reach him to get him to run against the president and call for elections and cause a stir during wartime, Zelensky was then posted online pictures of him shaking the president's hand, President Zelensky's hand, basically completely dispelling any idea that they were going to cause this division inside of Ukrainian political society. J.D. Vance was just straight up denied. And nobody else in the Ukrainian opposition, whether it be Petro Poroshenko, who I heard that they also tried to approach his people, or others like Timoshenko or the others in the opposition that was approached or they thought about approaching, none of them gave them a positive response of, yes, we're going to call for elections. Yes, we're going to do X, Y, Z. Every single one of them essentially said, look, it's not that we hate you guys, except for Zelensky, who basically ignored them. It's that we got to wait until after the war. Once the guns stop firing, that's when there will be a political consensus where we can come out and do this. We don't want to look like cowards. We don't want to look like we're dividing the country. We want to keep the country united. We don't want to, undercut the war effort in any way. So essentially, this quest that they went on, like, oh, well, if we don't like how Zelensky is standing up for his nation's interests, we can just get somebody who won't. Because they were fighting with him over the mineral deal. They were fighting with him over a long-term security agreement. Well, tough shit. You're stuck with him. And even if you did replace him with somebody like Zelensky, do you think Zelensky is going to sell out his country's infrastructure? You think Zelensky is going to sell out the bridges and the roads and the ports? You think Zelensky is going to say, we don't need any long-term security agreement. We don't need any long-term security guarantees, which now even J.D. Vance is going on TV saying that Ukraine needs. We've come a long way since the Oval Office meeting. Not a long way towards peace, but at least a long way rhetorically in some ways. Okay, what else we got here? Oh yes, we've got I got one more Ukraine thing